Imagine a city born from a desert, a mirage of neon and ambition, where fortunes are won and lost in the blink of an eye. Now, imagine the man who dreamed it into existence, a man with the mind of a visionary and the soul of a killer. This is not just a story about gangsters and gambling. It is the tragic epic of Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, the man who saw a glittering future in the barren Nevada sands and paid for that dream with his life. But before we descend into his world of glamour and violence, a crucial disclaimer. This entire narrative is pieced together from historical records, biographies, declassified documents, and first-hand accounts. Its purpose is not to glorify a criminal, but to present to you, the listener, the most accurate and compelling truth behind one of the most pivotal figures in American history. A story so incredible it often feels like fiction, yet every detail is rooted in the harsh reality of his time. So, settle in, close your eyes, and let your mind travel back, because the tale of Bugsy Siegel is a whirlwind that begins not in the desert, but in the squalid, overcrowded tenements of New York's Lower East Side, a world away from the glittering oasis he would one day conceive. It was here, in the heart of a different kind of jungle, that a young boy named Benjamin Siegelbaum first learned the brutal calculus of survival. Born on February 28, 1906, to poor Jewish immigrants from Austria, Hungary, his childhood was a relentless grind of poverty, a daily struggle that etched into him a burning, insatiable desire for something more, for something better, for a life that was the absolute opposite of the one he was born into. The streets of Williamsburg were his first classroom, and the lessons were harsh and unforgiving. He watched as his father, a humble peddler, worked himself to the bone for mere pennies, and the sight filled him not with sympathy, but with a deep, seated revulsion for a life of honest struggle. Why break your back for nothing, he reasoned, when there were easier, faster ways to acquire the riches and respect he craved. This mindset, this fundamental rejection of his inherited fate, was the first and most important seed of his future, a seed that would grow into a towering, if ultimately poisonous, tree. He was a handsome boy with dark, intense eyes and a charm that could be as disarming as his temper was terrifying. Even from a young age, he possessed an almost pathological hatred for the nickname Bugsy, a moniker derived from the slang term bugs, meaning crazy, which referred to his volatile, explosive nature. To cross him was to invite a storm of unrestrained violence, a trait that both repelled and attracted those around him. He wasn't just a bully, he was a force of nature, and he quickly understood that his fists and his fearlessness were a currency more valuable than the coins his father earned. He dropped out of school early, fully committing himself to the curriculum of the streets. And it was there, in the chaotic ecosystem of New York's juvenile gangs, that he would forge the most significant partnership of his life. A fellow young hustler, as ambitious and ruthless as himself, named Meyer, where Siegel was flashy, impulsive, and hot-headed. Lansky was quiet, calculating, and cerebral. They were opposites, but they recognized in each other a kindred spirit, a shared, bottomless ambition. Together, they formed a gang that would become the stuff of legend. A brutal and efficient organization that specialized in protection rackets, car theft, and gambling. This was the Bugs and Meyer mob, the prototype for what would later evolve into the modern, sophisticated, and infinitely more powerful national crime syndicate. Siegel was the muscle, the enforcer, the one who ensured that debts were paid and that disrespect was met with immediate and overwhelming force. He was the public face of their violence, the sharp, glittering edge of their operation. It was during this time that he began to cultivate the two personas that would define him until his dying day. The sophisticated, handsome man about town who craved acceptance in high society, and the cold, blooded killer who would stop at nothing to eliminate an obstacle or a rival. This duality was his engine, and it propelled him from the gritty streets of New York to the sun-drenched boulevards of Hollywood, where he would eventually meet his destiny in the vast, empty desert of Nevada. But that is a story for later. For now, picture him as a young man, his knuckles bruised, his pockets slowly filling with ill-gotten cash, his eyes fixed on a horizon far beyond the soot-stained brick of his tenement home. The dream was already there, flickering like a distant star, but the path to it would be paved with blood, betrayal, and a level of ambition that would ultimately consume him completely. The boy who hated being called Bugsy was gone, and in his place stood Bugsy Siegel, a man to be feared, a man to be respected, and a man who was just beginning to understand the intoxicating power of a truly grand, impossible vision. The transformation from a street-level thug to a national criminal operative required a catalyst, and for Bugsy Siegel, that catalyst was Prohibition. When the Volstead Act came into effect in 1920, it didn't create organized crime, but it provided the perfect, fertile ground for it to evolve from a series of local street gangs into a corporate-style enterprise. For Siegel and his partner Lansky, this was the opportunity of a lifetime. They were no longer just shaking down local shopkeepers. They were now in the business of supplying a nation with a commodity it desperately wanted, but was legally forbidden to have: alcohol. The Bugs and Meyer mob quickly integrated themselves into the bootlegging empire, forming alliances with other rising powers like Charles, Lucky, Luciano. Siegel's role expanded dramatically. He was no longer just an enforcer for his own small crew. He was now a key lieutenant in a burgeoning national syndicate, a trusted triggerman whose reputation for efficiency and ruthlessness made him one of the most feared men in the underworld. It was during this period that he truly honed his skills as an assassin, becoming a founding member of the enforcement arm of this new criminal coalition, a group that would become infamously known as Murder Incorporated. This was a cold, clinical, and business-like approach to homicide. Killings were not acts of passion, they were contracts. Assignments given to teams of shooters who would travel across the country to eliminate problems for the Syndicate. Siegel was a star performer in this deadly theater. He was handsome, well-dressed, and could blend into crowds, his charming demeanor disarming his targets until it was far too late. The violence of his youth had been channeled into a professional craft. He was said to be involved in dozens of murders, his name whispered in connection with some of the most notorious gangland hits of the era, including the elimination of old world mafia bosses like Joe, the Boss, Masseria, which helped usher in the modern, more corporate era of crime led by Luciano and Lansky. This was a time of immense power and profit for Siegel. The money flowing in from bootlegging was astronomical, and he spent it with the flamboyance that would become his trademark. He bought the finest clothes, drove the fastest cars, and cultivated an image of the successful, sophisticated businessman. But this was also a period of immense personal risk. The streets of New York and Chicago were a battlefield, and the life expectancy of a man in his position was notoriously short. It was this constant pressure, this ever-present threat of a sudden and violent death, that perhaps contributed to his next and most fateful move. The Syndicate, ever looking to diversify its interests beyond the soon-to-be repealed Prohibition, saw opportunity in the growing, largely unregulated gambling operations on the West Coast. They needed a man they could trust, a man with iron nerves, a proven track record, and the charisma to operate in the glamorous, yet treacherous, world of Hollywood. The choice was obvious. In the late 1930s, Bugsy Siegel, now in his early 30s, a millionaire many times over, and a legend in the underworld, said goodbye to the crowded, competitive East Coast and headed for California, to a land of sunshine, movie stars, and limitless possibility. He was going to be the Syndicate's man on the West Coast. But he had ambitions that stretched far beyond being a mere representative. He was going to build a kingdom. The transformation from a street-level thug to a national criminal operative required a catalyst, and for Bugsy Siegel, that catalyst was Prohibition. When the Volstead Act came into effect in 1920, it didn't create organized crime, but it provided the perfect, fertile ground for it to evolve from a series of local street gangs into a corporate-style enterprise. For Siegel and his partner Lansky, this was the opportunity of a lifetime. They were no longer just shaking down local shopkeepers. They were now in the business of supplying a nation with a commodity it desperately wanted, but was legally forbidden to have: alcohol. The Bugs and Meyer mob quickly integrated themselves into the bootlegging empire, forming alliances with other rising powers like Charles Lucky Luciano. Siegel's role expanded dramatically. He was no longer just an enforcer for his own small crew. He was now a key lieutenant in a burgeoning national syndicate, a trusted triggerman whose reputation for efficiency and ruthlessness made him one of the most feared men in the underworld. It was during this period that he truly honed his skills as an assassin, becoming a founding member of the enforcement arm of this new criminal coalition, a group that would become infamously known as Murder Incorporated. This was a cold, clinical, and businesslike approach to homicide. Killings were not acts of passion. They were assignments given to teams of shooters who would travel across the country to eliminate problems for the Syndicate. Siegel was a star performer in this deadly theater. He was handsome, well-dressed, and could blend into crowds. his charming demeanor disarming his targets until it was far too late. The violence of his youth had been channeled into a professional craft. He was said to be involved in dozens of murders. His name whispered in connection with some of the most notorious gangland hits of the era, including the elimination of old world mafia bosses like Joe, the Boss, Masseria, which helped usher in the modern, more corporate era of crime led by Luciano and Lansky. This was a time of immense power and profit for Siegel. The money flowing in from bootlegging was astronomical, and he spent it with the flamboyance that would become his trademark. He bought the finest clothes, drove the fastest cars, and cultivated an image of the successful, sophisticated businessman. But this was also a period of immense personal risk. The streets of New York and Chicago were a battlefield, and the life expectancy of a man in his position was notoriously short. It was this constant pressure, this ever-present threat of a sudden and violent death, that perhaps contributed to his next and most fateful move. The Syndicate, ever looking to diversify its interests beyond the soon-to-be repealed Prohibition, saw opportunity in the growing, largely unregulated gambling operations on the West Coast. They needed a man they could trust, a man with iron nerves, a proven track record, and the charisma to operate in the glamorous, yet treacherous, world of Hollywood. The choice was obvious. In the late 1930s, Bugsy Siegel, now in his early 30s, a millionaire many times over and a legend in the underworld, said goodbye to the crowded, competitive East Coast and headed for California, to a land of sunshine, movie stars, and limitless possibility. He was going to be the Syndicate's man on the West Coast. But he had ambitions that stretched far beyond being a mere representative. He was going to build a kingdom. His arrival in Los Angeles was less an infiltration and more a coronation. Bugsy Siegel didn't slink into the shadows of the city. He burst onto the Sunset Strip, a whirlwind of charisma, cash, and calculated charm. He rented a lavish suite at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, immediately establishing himself as a man of immense wealth and taste. This was a crucial part of his strategy. He wasn't here to be a gangster. He was here to be a mogul. He understood the power of perception in a town built on illusions, and he meticulously crafted a public persona as a wealthy sportsman and businessman. He was seen at the most exclusive nightclubs, his table always the best in the house, surrounded by a rotating cast of the most beautiful starlets and powerful men. He cultivated friendships with some of the biggest names in Hollywood, including actors like George Raft, who had built a career playing the very kind of gangster Siegel was in real life. This relationship was symbiotic. Raft enjoyed the frisson of danger that Siegel provided, while Siegel basked in the reflected glamour of a genuine movie star. He invested in legitimate businesses, including a string of offshore gambling ships that operated just outside the jurisdiction of California law, a venture that proved immensely profitable and further cemented his power base. But his most significant move, one that would forever intertwine his fate with the upper echelons of Hollywood society, was his relationship with the actress Virginia Hill. Hill was a force of nature in her own right, a beautiful, sharp-witted, and notoriously tempestuous woman with her own mysterious sources of income and a reputation for living life on her own extravagant terms. Together, Siegel and Hill became the undisputed king and queen of the Los Angeles underworld social scene, a dazzling, dangerous couple who embodied a new kind of American dream, one forged in nightclubs and financed by shadowy enterprises. Yet, beneath this glittering surface, Siegel was working tirelessly on behalf of his partners back east. He used his charm and his threats to muscle in on the local bookmaking operations, ensuring a steady flow of cash back to the Syndicate. He became the de facto arbiter of criminal disputes on the West Coast, his word carrying the weight of the entire national organization behind it. He lived in a magnificent mansion in Beverly Hills, a sprawling estate that served as both a family home for his wife and children, whom he kept largely separate from his flashy life, and a fortified command center, complete with armored shutters and a direct phone line to Meyer in New York. This was the pinnacle of Bugsy Siegel's life, the perfect fusion of his two warring selves. He was the respected businessman, the friend to stars, the lover of a famous actress, all while remaining the ruthless enforcer who could order a murder with a calm phone call. He had achieved everything he had ever wanted from the streets of Williamsburg. But for a man like Siegel, enough was never enough. The money and the fame were addictive, but they were also becoming mundane. He needed a new challenge, a project so grand, so audacious, that it would cement his legacy not as a mere gangster, but as a builder, a creator, a visionary. It was during this period of supreme confidence and power that a business trip would lead him to a dusty, unincorporated town in the state of Nevada, a place with a few small, primitive casinos and a lot of empty desert. The place was called Las Vegas, and when Bugsy Siegel looked at it, he didn't see a sleepy railroad stop. He saw a blank canvas, and on it, he began to paint a vision of unimaginable luxury and sin, a vision that would be called the Flamingo. His arrival in Los Angeles was less an infiltration and more a coronation. Bugsy Siegel didn't slink into the shadows of the city. He burst onto the Sunset Strip, a whirlwind of charisma, cash, and calculated charm. He rented a lavish suite at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, immediately establishing himself as a man of immense wealth and taste. This was a crucial part of his strategy. He wasn't here to be a gangster. He was here to be a mogul. He understood the power of perception in a town built on illusions, and he meticulously crafted a public persona as a wealthy sportsman and businessman. He was seen at the most exclusive nightclubs, his table always the best in the house, surrounded by a rotating cast of the most beautiful starlets and powerful men. He cultivated friendships with some of the biggest names in Hollywood, including actors like George Raft, who had built a career playing the very kind of gangster Siegel was in real life. This relationship was symbiotic. Raft enjoyed the frisson of danger that Siegel provided, while Siegel basked in the reflected glamour of a genuine movie star. He invested in legitimate businesses, including a string of offshore gambling ships that operated just outside the jurisdiction of California law, a venture that proved immensely profitable and further cemented his power base. But his most significant move, one that would forever intertwine his fate with the upper echelons of Hollywood society, was his relationship with the actress Virginia Hill. Hill was a force of nature in her own right, a beautiful, sharp-witted, and notoriously tempestuous woman with her own mysterious sources of income and a reputation for living life on her own extravagant terms. Together, Siegel and Hill became the undisputed king and queen of the Los Angeles underworld social scene, a dazzling, dangerous couple who embodied a new kind of American dream, one forged in nightclubs and financed by shadowy enterprises. Yet, beneath this glittering surface, Siegel was working tirelessly on behalf of his partners back east. He used his charm and his threats to muscle in on the local bookmaking operations, ensuring a steady flow of cash back to the Syndicate. He became the de facto arbiter of criminal disputes on the West Coast, his word carrying the weight of the entire national organization behind it. He lived in a magnificent mansion in Beverly Hills, a sprawling estate that served as both a family home for his wife and children, whom he kept largely separate from his flashy life, and a fortified command center, complete with armored shutters and a direct phone line to Meyer in New York. This was the pinnacle of Bugsy Siegel's life, the perfect fusion of his two warring selves. He was the respected businessman, the friend to stars, the lover of a famous actress, all while remaining the ruthless enforcer who could order a murder with a calm phone call. He had achieved everything he had ever wanted from the streets of Williamsburg, but for a man like Siegel, enough was never enough. The money and the fame were addictive, but they were also becoming mundane. He needed a new challenge, a project so grand, so audacious, that it would cement his legacy not as a mere gangster, but as a builder, a creator, a visionary. It was during this period of supreme confidence and power that a business trip would lead him to a dusty, unincorporated town in the state of Nevada, a place with a few small, primitive casinos and a lot of empty desert. The place was called Las Vegas, and when Bugsy Siegel looked at it, he didn't see a sleepy railroad stop. He saw a blank canvas, and on it, he began to paint a vision of unimaginable luxury and sin, a vision that would be called the Flamingo. The Las Vegas that Bugsy Siegel first encountered in the early 1940s was a far cry from the global entertainment capital it would become. It was a small, dusty town, a remote outpost whose main attractions were a few basic, sawdust, on-the-floor casinos catering to railroad workers, local ranchers, and soldiers from a nearby airbase. The gambling halls like the Il Rancho Vegas and the Last Frontier were rustic, Western-themed establishments, offering simple games and cheap buffets. They were profitable, but they lacked any sense of grandeur or sophistication. To Siegel, this was not a drawback. It was the entire point. His mind, trained to see opportunity where others saw only risk, perceived the immense potential in this legalized gambling oasis. He saw that the existing operations were merely selling the act of gambling itself. He envisioned selling an entire experience, a fantasy of luxury and exclusivity that would attract the very same Hollywood elite he had been courting for years. He wouldn't just build a casino, he would build a destination, a resort so opulent that the rich and famous would be willing to travel hundreds of miles into the desert just to be seen there. The initial project was not his own brainchild. It was the struggling vision of a Hollywood reporter and businessman named Billy Wilkerson, who had already begun construction on a hotel, casino on a patch of land along the lonely Los Angeles highway. Wilkerson had named it the Flamingo, after the long-legged birds that populated the grounds of his Hollywood estate. But Wilkerson, for all his connections, was chronically short on cash, and his construction was plagued by delays and financial woes. This is where Siegel saw his opening. He approached Wilkerson, first as a potential investor, then as a partner, and finally, through a series of forceful maneuvers and not so veiled threats, as the sole controller of the project. Using his influence with the Syndicate, Siegel secured an initial investment of over $1 million from his Eastern partners, including Meyer and Charles Luciano, who were intrigued by the idea of a legitimate, massive revenue stream in a wide, open town. With the funds secured and Wilkerson effectively pushed out, Siegel took complete command of the Flamingo. This was no longer just a business investment. It became his obsession, his masterpiece, the physical manifestation of his grandest ambitions. He was no longer content with the original, modest plans. He wanted everything to be the biggest, the best, the most luxurious. He envisioned a sprawling complex of lush, tropical gardens, an Olympic-sized swimming pool, a championship golf course, and a lavish casino floor that would rival the finest gaming halls of Monte Carlo. The hotel itself would be a marvel of modern design, with spacious air-conditioned suites, each with its own private bathroom and telephone. Unheard of luxuries for a hotel in the middle of the Nevada desert. He demanded only the finest materials, imported Italian marble, the most expensive silks and velvets, custom-made furniture, and gold-plated fixtures in the bathrooms. Nothing was too good for his Flamingo. He personally oversaw every detail, from the design of the menace to the hiring of the staff, micromanaging the project with a fervor that bordered on mania. The original budget was quickly obliterated. The cost of materials skyrocketed due to wartime shortages, a problem Siegel exacerbated by his insistence on using only the best, regardless of price or availability. He also faced significant cost overruns from an unexpected source, organized crime itself. The construction syndicate, controlled by his own associates, inflated their prices, and Siegel, perhaps blinded by his vision or believing himself untouchable, paid them without question. Truckloads of supplies would arrive, and the bills would be padded. Construction crews would work slow, knowing the boss was in a hurry and would pay overtime to meet his impossible deadlines. The initial $1 million evaporated, then $2 million, then $3 million. Siegel was forced to go back to his partners, again and again, asking for more money, assuring them that the returns would be astronomical once the doors opened. They were growing increasingly skeptical, their questions more pointed, their patience wearing thin. But Siegel, living in a rented house near the construction site with Virginia Hill, was too deep in his dream to see the warning signs. He was building a monument to himself, and in his mind, the cost was irrelevant. The Flamingo was no longer just a casino, it was his destiny, and he was rushing headlong toward it, unaware that the very dream he was building was also constructing the walls of his own tomb. The Las Vegas that Bugsy Siegel first encountered in the early 1940s was a far cry from the global entertainment capital it would become. It was a small, dusty town, a remote outpost whose main attractions were a few basic: sawdust on the floor casinos catering to railroad workers, local ranchers, and soldiers from a nearby airbase. The gambling halls like the El Rancho Vegas and the Last Frontier were rustic, Western-themed establishments, offering simple games and cheap buffets. They were profitable, but they lacked any sense of grandeur or sophistication. To Siegel, this was not a drawback, it was the entire point. His mind, trained to see opportunity where others saw only risk, perceived the immense potential in this legalized gambling oasis. He saw that the existing operations were merely selling the act of gambling itself. He envisioned selling an entire experience, a fantasy of luxury and exclusivity that would attract the very same Hollywood elite he had been courting for years. He wouldn't just build a casino, he would build a destination, a resort so opulent that the rich and famous would be willing to travel hundreds of miles into the desert just to be seen there. The initial project was not his own brainchild. It was the struggling vision of a Hollywood reporter and businessman named Billy Wilkerson, who had already begun construction on a hotel, casino on a patch of land along the lonely Los Angeles highway. Wilkerson had named it the Flamingo after the long-legged birds that populated the grounds of his Hollywood estate. But Wilkerson, for all his connections, was chronically short on cash, and his construction was plagued by delays and financial woes. This is where Siegel saw his opening. He approached Wilkerson first as a potential investor, then as a partner, and finally, through a series of forceful maneuvers and not so veiled threats, as the sole controller of the project. Using his influence with the Syndicate, Siegel secured an initial investment of over $1 million from his Eastern partners, including Meyer and Charles Luciano, who were intrigued by the idea of a legitimate, massive revenue stream in a wide, open town. With the funds secured and Wilkerson effectively pushed out, Siegel took complete command of the Flamingo. This was no longer just a business investment. It became his obsession, his masterpiece, the physical manifestation of his grandest ambitions. He was no longer content with the original, modest plans. He wanted everything to be the biggest, the best, the most luxurious. He envisioned a sprawling complex of lush, tropical gardens, an Olympic-sized swimming pool, a championship golf course, and a lavish casino floor that would rival the finest gaming halls of Monte Carlo. The hotel itself would be a marvel of modern design, with spacious air-conditioned suites, each with its own private bathroom and telephone. Unheard of luxuries for a hotel in the middle of the Nevada desert. He demanded only the finest materials: imported Italian marble, the most expensive silks and velvets, custom-made furniture, and gold-plated fixtures in the bathrooms. Nothing was too good for his Flamingo. He personally oversaw every detail, from the design of the menus to the hiring of the staff, micromanaging the project with a fervor that bordered on mania. The original budget was quickly obliterated. The cost of materials skyrocketed due to wartime shortages, a problem Siegel exacerbated by his insistence on using only the best, regardless of price or availability. He also faced significant cost overruns from an unexpected source: organized crime itself. The construction syndicate, controlled by his own associates, inflated their prices, and Siegel, perhaps blinded by his vision or believing himself untouchable, paid them without question. Truckloads of supplies would arrive, and the bills would be padded. Construction crews would work slow, knowing the boss was in a hurry and would pay overtime to meet his impossible deadlines. The initial $1 million evaporated, then $2 million, then $3 million. Siegel was forced to go back to his partners, again and again, asking for more money, assuring them that the returns would be astronomical once the doors opened. They were growing increasingly skeptical, their questions more pointed, their patience wearing thin. But Siegel, living in a rented house near the construction site with Virginia Hill, was too deep in his dream to see the warning signs. He was building a monument to himself, and in his mind, the cost was irrelevant. The Flamingo was no longer just a casino, it was his destiny, and he was rushing headlong toward it, unaware that the very dream he was building was also constructing the walls of his own tomb. As the Flamingo's skeletal structure rose from the desert floor, so too did the pressure on Bugsy Siegel, a pressure that began to warp his famous charm into something brittle and paranoid. The financial sinkhole was now undeniable, the initial estimates a distant, laughable memory. The project, which had begun with a budget of around $1.5 million, was now spiraling toward an unimaginable $6 million, a sum that stunned even his most hardened criminal partners. This was no longer an investment, it was a bottomless pit, and Siegel was the man shoveling their money into it. Whispers of embezzlement began to circulate through the underworld, whispers that were given credence by the extravagant lifestyle of Virginia Hill, who was known to make large, unexplained cash deposits into Swiss bank accounts. Funds that his partners suspected were skimmed directly from the Flamingo's construction budget. Siegel's explanations became increasingly desperate and convoluted. He blamed the cost overruns on the war, on corrupt contractors, on unforeseen engineering challenges, on anything and everything but his own grandiose mismanagement. His partners, men like Meyer, who had grown up with him and trusted him implicitly, found themselves in an impossible position. They were businessmen first and foremost, and the Flamingo was a catastrophic business failure in the making. They began to hold secret meetings, their discussions no longer about profit, but about liability and loss. The man they had sent to the West Coast as their ambassador was now seen as a rogue agent, a liability who was either dangerously incompetent or worse, brazenly stealing from them. Siegel, insulated by his obsession and his belief in his own invincibility, seemed oblivious to the gathering storm. He was fixated on a single goal, a grand opening before Christmas of 1946. He believed that one spectacular night would erase all the doubts, that the flood of cash from the high rollers would silence the critics and make everyone forget the astronomical costs. This desperate race against time led to a decision that would prove to be one of his most catastrophic miscalculations. He decided to open the casino before the hotel was even completed. On December 26, 1946, against all practical advice, the Flamingo opened its doors for the first time. Siegel had pulled out all the stops to ensure it would be the social event of the season. He had his friend George Raft serve as the unofficial master of ceremonies. He flew in dozens of Hollywood's biggest stars, putting them up in the few finished rooms and comping their every bet. The event was a spectacle of forced glamour, but beneath the surface, it was a disaster in the making. The weather was unseasonably cold and rainy, turning the unfinished grounds into a sea of mud. Many of the invited celebrities, including stars like Jimmy Durante and Xavier Cugat, whose orchestra was hired for the event, found themselves stranded at the Los Angeles airport due to the poor weather, their private planes unable to take off. Those who did make it to Las Vegas were greeted by a construction site. The hotel rooms weren't ready, forcing guests to seek accommodation at rival casinos. The casino itself, though beautiful, was plagued with technical problems. But the most fatal flaw was one that Siegel, in his hubris, had never anticipated. The gambling was crooked. The Syndicate, in a move that revealed their utter lack of faith in Siegel's management, had installed their own crew to run the games, and they had rigged them to ensure the house would win big on opening night. The high, rolling Hollywood crowd, sophisticated gamblers all, quickly detected the scam. The feeling of being cheated, of being treated like marks instead of honored guests, was a fatal blow to the Flamingo's reputation. The opening was a humiliating failure. The crowds vanished after New Year's, and the casino, which had been bleeding money during construction, began to hemorrhage it at an even faster rate. The disastrous opening weekend confirmed his partner's worst fears. The man was not just a failure. He was a fool who had embarrassed them in front of the entire world. The final straw for many was the revelation, whether true or not, that Siegel and Virginia Hill had been siphoning millions. The trust was broken. The ledger was deep in the red, and in the cold, unforgiving calculus of the Syndicate, a decision was made. Bugsy Siegel's dream had become a $6 million nightmare, and there was only one way to balance the books. The visionary was now a write-off. The final act of Benjamin Siegel's life began not with a bang, but with the quiet, ominous ticking of a clock he could no longer hear. The catastrophic failure of the Flamingo's grand opening had severed the last fragile threads of patience and trust his partners back East had for him. In their eyes, he was no longer the charismatic visionary, but a reckless liability who had squandered an unimaginable fortune. and, perhaps more damningly, had made them a laughingstock. The whispers of embezzlement, fueled by Virginia Hill's frequent trips to Europe with suitcases full of cash, had solidified into a grim certainty within the council of the Syndicate. A secret meeting was convened, a gathering of the most powerful and ruthless men in American organized crime, and the sole item on the agenda was the problem of Bugsy Siegel. The evidence was laid out before them: the spiraling costs, the embarrassing opening night, the suspicious flow of funds to Hill, and Siegel's own arrogant defiance when questioned. The verdict was swift and unanimous. A contract was put out on his life. The man who had once been a founding member of Murder, Incorporated, who had sat in judgment on the lives of so many others, was now its latest and most high-profile target. The irony was as cold as the decision itself. Siegel, however, was not entirely oblivious to the danger. The underworld telegraph was still active, and faint warnings reached him. Hints from old contacts that the air had grown thin and that he should be careful. But his colossal ego acted as a shield against reality. He could not, or would not, believe that his oldest friends, men like Meyer, would ever sanction his murder. He dismissed the threats as jealousy, as the grumblings of small-minded men who couldn't grasp his grand vision. He was Bugsy Siegel, the man who had charmed Hollywood and was building a miracle in the desert. He believed himself to be untouchable. He threw himself into a frantic effort to save the Flamingo, pouring what little remaining capital he could access into finally completing the hotel. He was like a captain desperately trying to plug the leaks in a sinking ship, blind to the fact that the mutiny had already happened. In a last, desperate gamble, he closed the casino entirely in January 1947, vowing to reopen it only when every detail was perfect, when it truly embodied the dream he had originally sold to the world. This final act of defiance, this closing of the doors in the face of his critics, may have been the confirmation his enemies needed that he was beyond reason. The clock was now ticking down in earnest. The Syndicate appointed a new man, Gus Greenbaum, to take over the Flamingo operations. Once Siegel was gone, a clear signal that his fate was sealed. Even Virginia Hill, sensing the shifting winds, fled to Europe in early June, her departure a silent scream of impending doom that Siegel either ignored or misunderstood. He was isolated, surrounded by the beautiful, empty rooms of his Beverly Hills mansion, a king in a castle whose walls were about to crumble. The evening of June 20th, 1947, was unseasonably warm in Los Angeles. Bugsy Siegel was spending it at the Beverly Hills home of his girlfriend, Virginia Hill, who was conveniently abroad. He had been in a surprisingly good mood, having just returned from a trip to Las Vegas, where the newly completed Flamingo was, for the first time, showing a small profit. To his mind, this was the turning point, the proof that he had been right all along. He sat in the living room, reading the Los Angeles Times, perhaps allowing himself a moment of belief that the worst was behind him. He was talking with his associate, Alan Smiley, about the future. At approximately 10:30 p.m., the world outside was quiet. Inside, the scene was domestic, almost peaceful. Siegel was seated on a plush sofa, his back to a large picture window that looked out onto the darkened garden. The window was open, its curtains drawn, offering no protection, no warning. From the shadows of the garden, a figure moved. An assassin, later believed to be multiple gunmen working in concert, leveled a military grade M1 carbine at the silhouette on the sofa. The first shot shattered the window and struck Siegel in the head, killing him instantly. The following 8 shots were a formality, a brutal overkill that riddled his body and sent a message as clear as it was violent. The force of the blasts threw him from the sofa, his body coming to rest on the floor, his dreams and his life extinguished in a single, shocking moment of violence. The scene was one of surreal horror. Blood stained the expensive furnishings, and the acrid smell of gunpowder mixed with the scent of night, blooming jasmine from the garden. Alan Smiley, miraculously unharmed, could only stare in stunned disbelief. The killer, or killers, vanished into the night, leaving behind only the echo of gunfire and the corpse of the man who had dreamed of Las Vegas. The news of his murder spread like a wildfire, splashing across front pages from coast to coast. It was more than just another gangland slaying. It was the spectacular fall of a celebrity criminal, the man who had been photographed with movie stars and who had built a palace in the desert. The police investigation yielded little. There were no fingerprints, no murder weapon recovered, no credible witnesses. It was a professional hit, clean and efficient, the kind Siegel himself had once orchestrated. In a chilling and perfectly timed coincidence, at the very moment Siegel was being killed in Beverly Hills, Gus Greenbaum and his men walked into the Flamingo in Las Vegas and calmly took control of the casino. The transition of power was seamless. A cold-blooded corporate takeover finalized with a volley of gunfire hundreds of miles away. Bugsy Siegel was dead at 41 years old. He was buried in a Hollywood cemetery. His funeral attended by a curious mix of mobsters, celebrities, and reporters, all there to pay their respects to a ghost, the ghost of a future that had been shot dead through a picture window. His legacy, however, was just beginning. The Flamingo, under the Syndicate's efficient management, quickly became the roaring success he had always promised it would be, proving that his vision was right, but his execution had been fatally flawed. He had been the spark, the catalyst, the dreamer. Others would reap the billions his dream generated. Las Vegas would rise from the desert, a monument to greed and glamour, a city forever haunted by the ghost of the man who saw it first, the man who paid for that vision with everything he had. The immediate aftermath of the assassination was a study in the cold, efficient machinery of the underworld, a stark contrast to the chaotic and public violence of the murder itself. Even as the police swarmed Virginia Hill's Beverly Hills home, cataloging the gruesome scene and trying to piece together a narrative from a terrified Alan Smiley, the real power shift was happening 270 miles away in the neon-drenched desert. At the very hour Bugsy Siegel's body was being discovered, a team of men led by Gus Greenbaum, a trusted and ruthless lieutenant of the Syndicate, walked calmly into the Flamingo Hotel and casino. There was no argument, no resistance. The staff, from the dealers to the managers, understood the new reality instantly. This was not a negotiation, it was a declaration. Greenbaum presented himself as the new authority, there to stabilize the operation, and most importantly, to start generating a return on the Syndicate's massive, and now blood-soaked investment. The takeover was so seamless it felt rehearsed, because in many ways it was. The plans had been laid weeks, if not months, in advance. Siegel's fate had been sealed long before the first bullet shattered the window, and the business continuity plan was executed with a chilling lack of sentiment. The message was clear. The individual was disposable, but the enterprise was eternal. The Flamingo was no longer Bugsy's folly. It was now a corporate asset, and it was time for it to start earning its keep. Back in Los Angeles, the investigation spiraled into a maze of dead ends and silent witnesses. The Los Angeles Police Department questioned everyone from movie stars to known mob associates, but they were met with a wall of omerta, the code of silence that was as impenetrable as any fortress. Those who might have known something had suddenly developed profound amnesia. The murder weapon, a military carbine, was never found. The killers, likely a team of 2 or 3 imported shooters who had already left the state by the time the sun rose, vanished into the ether. There were theories, of course. Some pointed to Meyer, believing he had given the final, reluctant approval to save the larger enterprise. Others suspected Charles Luciano, operating from his exile in Italy, or Siegel's old enemy, Jack Dragna, the Los Angeles crime boss whose territory Siegel had so brazenly invaded, but no one was ever charged with the murder of Benjamin Siegel. It remains, to this day, one of America's most famous unsolved crimes, a perfect gangland hit. His funeral, however, was a spectacle of bizarre contradictions, a microcosm of the 2 worlds he had straddled. It was held at the Hollywood Cemetery, and the mourners formed a strange tapestry of his fractured life. There were the hard-faced men from his past, the gangsters and enforcers from New York and Chicago, their presence a silent tribute to the killer he had been. And then there were the glamorous faces from his present, the actors and socialites like George Raft, who came to mourn the charming, generous host and visionary they had known. The press swarmed the event, turning his burial into a macabre media circus. He was laid to rest in a lavish bronze casket, a final touch of the opulence he so loved. But the service was marked by a palpable tension, a sense that even in death, Bugsy Siegel was a man out of place, never fully belonging to either the world of crime or the world of fame he so desperately coveted. In the weeks and months that followed, the legend of Bugsy Siegel began to ossify, transforming from a current event into a foundational myth. The press, having feasted on the details of his life and death, now began to craft the narrative that would endure for decades. The visionary gangster who was murdered for his dreams. And the most potent fuel for this legend was the astonishing success of the Flamingo under its new management. Gus Greenbaum and the Syndicate did not change Siegel's vision. They simply made it profitable. They cut the excess, managed the costs, and ran the casino with the disciplined, corporate efficiency that Siegel had lacked. The high rollers returned, assured that the games were now fair, or at least fairly crooked in the house's favor. The hotel, finally complete, became the destination Siegel had promised. The Flamingo began to generate immense profits, a river of cash that flowed back to the Syndicate and proved, in the most brutal way possible, that Bugsy's dream was not the failure they had thought, but a gold mine they had simply needed to take from its incompetent creator. This success cemented his status as a tragic figure, a man ahead of his time, a martyr to his own ambition. He became the ghost at the feast of modern Las Vegas, his story a cautionary tale told and retold as the city exploded in a frenzy of construction, each new casino, hotel. From the sands to the Stardust to the Riviera, standing as a testament to the blueprint he had created and died for. His death had not killed his idea, it had sanctified it. The model of the luxury resort, casino, offering gambling, world-class entertainment, fine dining, and a fantasy of opulence, became the unshakable template for every venture that followed. Las Vegas was no longer a dusty stopover for railroad workers. It was becoming the entertainment capital of the world, and every neon sign that flickered to life was, in a way, a tribute to the man who first saw that potential. Yet, for those who had known him, his legacy was more complex, a haunting reminder of the price of ambition. Meyer, it is said, never spoke of Siegel's murder, but the shadow of it lingered over him for the rest of his life, a painful fracture in a lifelong friendship. Virginia Hill, questioned relentlessly by the FBI and by a congressional committee, eventually broke under the pressure, her life descending into tragedy and ending in a suspected suicide in Europe years later. The Syndicate, meanwhile, learned a powerful lesson from the entire episode. They learned that visionaries were dangerous and that dreams were too expensive when left in the hands of dreamers. They continued to invest in Las Vegas, but they did so from the shadows, installing anonymous, reliable managers to run their operations, men who would never fall in love with the dream, only with the bottom line. Bugsy Siegel's rise and fall became the creation myth of modern Las Vegas, a city built on a paradox, a place where dreams are manufactured and sold, but where dreamers are ultimately consumed. His story is the original sin of the Strip, a tale of blood and money, of a mirage made real, and of the man who gazed too long into its shimmering depths and was destroyed by the reflection he saw there. The ghost of Bugsy Siegel did not haunt the corridors of the Flamingo. It was woven into the very neon fabric of Las Vegas itself, becoming the city's foundational myth, a cautionary tale whispered on the desert wind. In the years immediately following his murder, the city he had envisioned began its explosive, relentless expansion, a boomtown fueled by syndicate money and a nation's growing appetite for sanctioned sin. The success of the Flamingo under Gus Greenbaum was the green light for every other mobster with ambition and capital. The Desert Inn, the Sands, the Riviera, the Stardust. Each new mega resort that pierced the skyline was a direct descendant of Siegel's original concept, each one trying to outdo the last in luxury, spectacle, and sheer audacity. The model was flawless. Create a self-contained paradise in the desert where a visitor could gamble. See a superstar like Frank Sinatra or Dean Martin enjoy a gourmet meal and lounge by a pristine pool, all without ever needing to leave the property. This was Siegel's vision executed with cold, corporate precision. The men who built these empires, however, learned from his fatal flaw. They remained in the shadows, their names unknown to the public, their faces absent from the society pages. They hired front men, legitimate businessmen, and charismatic hosts to be the public face of their operations. The era of the flamboyant gangster mogul died with Bugsy Siegel on that Beverly Hills sofa. The era of the faceless corporate criminal had begun. Las Vegas became the ultimate money machine for organized crime, a place to not only make billions, but to launder billions more from its other, darker enterprises across the country. The city was a black hole that sucked in cash and spat out clean, taxable revenue. And at the heart of this entire glittering, immoral enterprise was the ghost of the man who had seen it first, the prophet who was not honored in his own land, the dreamer whose blueprint was followed with religious fervor precisely because he had been sacrificed for it. His tragedy became the Syndicate's textbook, and his dream, stripped of his personality and his excess, became their most profitable product. This posthumous influence extended far beyond the balance sheets of the mob. Bugsy Siegel became an American icon, a symbol of a certain kind of dangerous glamour. He was immortalized in books, in newspaper articles, and eventually in films and television shows. He was often portrayed as a tragic romantic, a man destroyed by the purity of his own vision, a characterization that conveniently glossed over the brutal reality of his life as a prolific killer and extortionist. The nickname, Bugsy, which he had loathed with every fiber of his being, became a permanent fixture, a brand name for his legend. He was transformed from a complex, violent man into a simplified archetype, the gangster as visionary. This cultural repackaging ensured his survival in the popular imagination long after the specific details of his crimes had faded. For the city of Las Vegas, this legend was priceless. It provided a romantic, exciting, and slightly dangerous origin story, a far more compelling narrative than the mundane truth of corporate financial planning. The Flamingo, which still operates today as a cornerstone of the Strip, trades heavily on this history, its very name evoking the man who will forever be its creator. Tourists can walk through the very casino floor he designed, though much altered over the decades, and feel a shiver of connection to that fateful night in 1947. He is to Las Vegas what Henry Ford is to the automobile or Walt Disney is to animation. The founding father, the original source, but his legacy is also a permanent stain, a reminder that the city's glittering foundations are poured in concrete mixed with blood and betrayal. The story of his murder serves as the city's original sin, a dark fairy tale that warns of the cost of reaching too high, of dreaming too big in a world where dreams are a commodity controlled by ruthless men. It is a paradox that defines Las Vegas to this day, a city that sells fantasy, yet whose creation myth is a stark lesson in reality. The neon lights that now blaze in a continuous, artificial day are the millions of tiny funeral candles for Benjamin Siegel, each one a testament to a dream that was real, a vision that was true, and a price that was paid in full, not with money, but with a life cut short by the very forces that would ultimately make his dream come true for everyone but himself. To truly understand the scale of Bugsy Siegel's legacy, one must look at the Las Vegas that exists today, a global metropolis of unimaginable scale and opulence, and trace a direct line back to his singular, flawed vision. The city that now boasts pyramids, replicas of the Eiffel Tower, and dancing fountains is the ultimate fulfillment of his prophecy, a place where the impossible is made manifest through sheer will and astronomical investment. The fundamental business model he pioneered, the integrated resort casino, remains the unchallenged template not only for the Las Vegas Strip, but for gambling hubs all over the world, from Macau to Singapore. Every time a visitor books a package that includes a flight, a hotel room, show tickets, and dining credits, they are participating in a commercial ecosystem that Siegel was the first to conceptualize. He understood that the real money was not just in the slot machines or the card tables, but in capturing every single dollar a tourist possessed from the moment they arrived until the moment they left, exhausted and exhilarated. This was a revolutionary idea in the 1940s, a time when casinos were simply places to gamble. Siegel saw them as the beating heart of a much larger organism, a self-sustaining fantasyland. The modern corporations that now dominate the Strip, with their focus on shareholder value and brand loyalty, are the logical, sanitized evolution of his criminal enterprise. They have replaced the mob's hidden ownership with stock ticker symbols and corporate boards, but the core principle is identical. Create an all-encompassing environment that discourages leaving and encourages spending. The spectacle has grown more sophisticated. If from the synchronized waters of the Bellagio to the aerial acrobatics of Cirque du Soleil. But these are merely technological advancements on Siegel's original insight that people crave an escape, a narrative, an experience. He was selling a story of luxury and exclusivity. His successors now sell stories of ancient Rome, of tropical paradise, of a futuristic New York. The packaging has changed, but the product is the same. His personal influence also set a cultural tone for the city that persisted for decades, a unique blend of criminal notoriety and Hollywood glamour. For years after his death, Las Vegas was the playground for the Rat Pack, Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., men who embodied a similar cool, dangerous charm, and who were themselves notoriously connected to the very same underworld figures who had killed Siegel. The shadowy backroom deals, the skim operations that funneled cash to the mob, the presence of intimidating security consultants. This was the atmosphere of Las Vegas well into the 1980s, an atmosphere that Siegel had helped create when he first brought Hollywood to the desert. He was the prototype for the well-connected, charismatic figure who moved effortlessly between the world of legitimate entertainment and the world of organized crime. This duality became part of the city's allure. Visitors flocked to Vegas not just to gamble, but to feel a faint, thrilling whisper of danger, to imagine that they might rub shoulders with a real, life gangster at the next blackjack table. This was the mythology that Siegel's life and death authored. A mythology that was carefully cultivated and sold as part of the Vegas experience. Even as the corporate giants like Steve Wynn ushered in a new era of family-friendly, Disney-fied mega resorts in the 1990s, attempting to scrub the city clean of its mobbed up past, the ghost of Bugsy Siegel refused to be exorcised. His story was too potent, too romantic, too fundamentally intertwined with the city's identity. Today, you can still feel his presence. It's in the older casinos that retain a whiff of their mid-century origins, in the biographies that line bookstore shelves, and in the countless documentaries and films that continue to retell his saga. He is a permanent part of the city's brand, a symbol of its wild, untamed, and morally ambiguous origins. The story of his rise and fall serves as a permanent reminder of the high-stakes game that built Las Vegas, a game where the ultimate bet was not placed on a roulette wheel, but on a man's ambition, and where the house, as it always does, eventually won. The city he dreamed into existence now stands as his mausoleum, a billion-dollar monument to a vision that was both brilliant and fatal, a testament to the fact that sometimes the dreamer must die for the dream to live. The story of Bugsy Siegel, however, is far more than a simple tale of a gangster with a grand vision. It is a profound and enduring American tragedy that holds a mirror to the nation's own complex relationship with ambition, morality, and the very concept of the self-made man. On one hand, he embodies the ultimate Horatio Alger myth, the poor immigrant boy who rises from the squalor of the tenements to a life of unimaginable wealth and influence, rubbing shoulders with the elite and literally reshaping the landscape of his country. He pursued the American dream with a ferocity and single-mindedness that could be admired, if not for the horrific means he employed to achieve it. His dream of Las Vegas is, in its purest form, a monument to capitalism, a city built not on industry or agriculture, but on the pure, unadulterated pursuit of pleasure and profit. In this light, Siegel can be seen as a dark innovator, a ruthless entrepreneur who identified an untapped market and had the audacity to build it from nothing. Yet, this is where the myth curdles into tragedy. The same unchecked ambition that propelled him from the streets also contained the seeds of his own destruction. The American dream promises that success is the reward for hard work and daring. But Siegel's life illustrates the dark corollary to that promise, that in a world without rules, the most ruthless often rise the highest, but they also create the very forces that will inevitably tear them down. His inability to separate his personal grandiosity from his business decisions, his belief that his vision placed him above the practical financial concerns of his partners, was his fatal flaw. He was, in the end, a victim of the same lawless ecosystem he had helped to create and dominate. The syndicate that funded him operated on a brutal Darwinian logic. And when Siegel ceased to be an asset and became a liability, he was removed with the same cold efficiency with which he himself had eliminated so many others. His death is the final, brutal act of the tragedy, the moment when the protagonist is destroyed by the very qualities that once defined his greatness. This tragic arc raises unsettling questions that resonate far beyond the world of organized crime. Siegel's story forces us to confront the blurred line between visionary and fanatic, between entrepreneur and conman. At what point does ambition become hubris? When does a grand dream become a dangerous delusion? He was a man who believed so completely in his own destiny that he lost touch with the reality of his situation, a trait shared by many celebrated business titans throughout history. The only difference was that his board of directors didn't fire him, they assassinated him. His life is a stark lesson in the perils of operating outside the boundaries of society, where there are no courts of appeal, only the final judgment of a bullet. Furthermore, his relationship with Las Vegas is a poignant metaphor for the nature of creation itself. He was the spark, the catalyst, the origin point of an idea so powerful it would transform the world. But like many creators, he was unable to control his creation. He gave life to Las Vegas, and in return, it consumed him. The city grew and prospered, learning from his mistakes and refining his vision, while he became a footnote in its history, a ghost in the machine. This is the ultimate irony of his existence. The thing he loved most, the dream to which he dedicated his final years and his very life, is what killed him. And in a final, cruel twist, that same dream only found true success after he was gone, proving that his vision was right, but that he himself was the obstacle to its realization. Bugsy Siegel's story, therefore, is not just a chapter in the history of crime or the city of Las Vegas. It is a timeless parable about the cost of dreams, the price of ambition, and the fragile, often fatal, connection between a creator and his creation. It reminds us that every glittering skyline has its hidden foundations, and that sometimes the brightest lights are fueled by the darkest fires. The enduring fascination with Bugsy Siegel, a figure now decades gone, speaks to something deep within the American psyche. A collective captivation with the outlaw who dares to dream on a monumental scale. He is not remembered with the same uncomplicated revulsion as other murderers of his era, nor is he celebrated as a pure hero. Instead, he occupies a unique and ambiguous space in our cultural memory, the flawed architect of a modern Babylon. His story continues to be told and retold because it is a perfect dramatic storm, containing all the essential elements of a classic epic. There is the meteoric rise from nothing, a narrative we are culturally programmed to admire. There is the Shakespearean fatal flaw, his hubris and volatile temper, which guarantees his downfall. There is the compelling romance with the glamorous and mysterious Virginia Hill, a relationship steeped in passion, luxury, and shared peril. And there is the spectacular, violent denouement, a death that is both shocking and poetically just, a cinematic end for a man who lived his life as if he were the star of his own movie. This narrative is simply too powerful to fade away. It has been the subject of countless books, scholarly articles, and Hollywood biopics, most famously Warren Beatty's 1991 film, Bugsy, which played a significant role in cementing his legend for a new generation. These retellings, while taking artistic license, consistently focus on the tragedy of the visionary, often softening the more brutal edges of his reality as a cold-blooded killer. We are invited to sympathize with his dream, to marvel at his audacity, and to mourn his potential, even as we are reminded of his crimes. This selective memory is a testament to the power of a compelling story. We are willing to overlook a multitude of sins when they are packaged with such grand ambition and world-altering consequence. Siegel the man has been largely replaced by Siegel the myth, a symbol of a grittier, more dangerous, and somehow more romantic era in American history. His legacy is also a Rorschach test, revealing what we value and what we choose to ignore. For the city of Las Vegas, he is the necessary, if problematic, founding father. His name is invoked with a wink and a nod, a crucial part of the city's marketing, as a place where the rules are different and history is written by rebels for students of crime. He is a pivotal figure in the transition of organized crime from a collection of ethnic street gangs into a sophisticated, corporate-style national syndicate, a key player in the creation of Murder, Inc., and the expansion of the mob's reach to the West Coast. For cultural critics, his life is a rich text on the nature of American celebrity, the allure of the gangster archetype, and the dark underbelly of the capitalist dream. And for the everyday person, he remains simply a fascinating character, a real-life Gatsby, whose parties were just as lavish and whose end was far more brutal. The unanswered questions surrounding his murder continue to fuel speculation and debate, keeping his story alive in the realm of true crime. Was Meyer ultimately responsible? Did the order come from Lucky Luciano in Italy? Were there other, more personal grievances that sealed his fate? The lack of closure creates a perpetual mystery, an open file that invites endless re-examination. Bugsy Siegel's life, in its entirety, serves as a permanent monument to a singular, terrifying, and exhilarating idea that one man, armed with nothing but sheer will, a complete lack of scruples, and a vision of something that did not yet exist, can change the world. He looked into a vast, empty desert and saw a cathedral of light and desire. He willed it into existence, and in the process, he forged his own legend and sealed his own tragic fate, ensuring that his name would echo through the neon canyons of Las Vegas for as long as the lights continue to glow against the dark desert sky. To fully grasp the depth of Bugsy Siegel's fall, one must understand the intricate and unforgiving world he helped to build, a world that ultimately turned on him with the cold precision of a machine. The National Crime Syndicate was not a brotherhood in the sentimental sense. It was a corporation, and its currency was not loyalty, but money and power. Siegel's fatal error was in forgetting this fundamental truth. He began to see the Flamingo not as a syndicate investment, but as his personal fiefdom, his masterpiece. And in doing so, he committed the one sin the organization could not forgive. He threatened the financial stability and, just as importantly, the perceived judgment of the collective. The initial investments from men like Meyer, Frank Costello, and Joe Adonis were not gifts. They were high-risk loans with an expectation of monumental returns. As the budget for the Flamingo ballooned from $1 million to $6 million, it wasn't just the staggering sum that alarmed his partners, it was the principle. If Siegel could mismanage, or, as they increasingly suspected, embezzle, $6 million on a desert fantasy, what precedent did that set for every other enterprise they controlled? It was a crack in the foundation of their entire operation, and in their world, cracks were not repaired, they were eliminated. The whispers about Virginia Hill's frequent trips to Europe with suitcases full of cash were the final, damning evidence. To the Syndicate, this wasn't just theft, it was a personal betrayal. A slap in the face to the men who had trusted him since they were boys on the streets of New York. The decision to issue a contract on his life was therefore not an act of hot, blooded vengeance, but a cold, calculated business decision. It was a message to every other member of their organization. No one is irreplaceable, and the enterprise is always greater than the individual. The heartbreaking irony is that Siegel likely never saw it coming from his oldest friends. He believed his shared history with Lansky, their decades of partnership from the Bugs and Meyer mob to the heights of the Syndicate would shield him. He failed to realize that in the calculus of survival, sentiment holds no value. His murder was the ultimate enforcement of corporate policy, a stark demonstration that the same rules of ruthless efficiency he had helped create and enforce were now being applied to him. He was, in the most literal sense, hoist with his own petard, a victim of the very system he was instrumental in designing. The aftermath of his death solidified this new corporate ethos. The Syndicate did not skip a beat. The immediate and seamless takeover of the Flamingo by Gus Greenbaum was a masterclass in organizational management, a clear signal that the project was always bigger than the man. And when the Flamingo, under this new, disciplined management, began to turn a massive profit almost immediately, it retroactively justified Siegel's elimination in the most concrete terms possible. It proved that the vision was sound, but the visionary was flawed. This lesson was absorbed into the very DNA of organized crime's involvement in Las Vegas for the next 3 decades. The men who followed, the unseen bosses who controlled the Stardust, the Desert Inn, and the Riviera, operated from the shadows. They were accountants and strategists, not flamboyant celebrities. They understood that the goal was to generate quiet, consistent wealth, not to build personal monuments. The era of the public-facing gangster was over. Siegel's corpse in Beverly Hills was the closing argument for anonymity. His life and death became the foundational case study in their business school of crime, a permanent warning against the dangers of ego and the absolute necessity of subsuming one's identity for the good of the organization. In this way, Bugsy Siegel's most lasting contribution to the underworld may not have been the Flamingo itself, but the object lesson his corpse provided. He was the catalyst that perfected the model of faceless, corporate ownership, a model that allowed the mob to skim billions from the Las Vegas Strip for decades, without most of the public ever knowing their names. He dreamed of a legacy of glitter and glamour, but the legacy he actually left for his peers was one of caution, a blueprint for how to profit from a dream without ever being foolish enough to fall in love with it. The city he envisioned grew and thrived precisely because the men who came after him learned to be everything he was not: anonymous, pragmatic, and utterly devoid of the grand, self-destructive ambition that made him both a legend and a ghost. The character of Bugsy Siegel himself remains an enigma, a collection of violent contradictions that somehow coalesced into a single, transformative force. To understand him is to accept that he contained two warring souls within one body. There was the man who could, with genuine charm and generosity, befriend Hollywood's biggest stars, who adored his children and sought to provide them with a life of stability and privilege far removed from his own brutal upbringing. This was the Siegel who was meticulous about his appearance, who valued culture and sophistication, and who genuinely believed in the beautiful, luxurious world he was trying to build in the desert. He was not merely pretending to be a gentleman. A part of him desperately wanted to be one, to transcend his origins and be accepted on his own terms as a builder and a visionary. This was the man who dreamed of the Flamingo's Art Deco curves and lush gardens, who understood the psychology of luxury and the power of a grand experience. Yet, living alongside this aspirational figure was the product of the Williamsburg streets, the ruthless killer from the Bugs and Meyer mob, a man whose temper was a terrifying, unpredictable force. This was the Siegel who could calmly order a murder or carry one out himself without a flicker of remorse, who viewed violence as a necessary and efficient tool for problem solving. This was the man who was so feared that even his closest associates hesitated to call him Bugsy to his face. These two halves were not separate, they were intertwined, each fueling the other. His violent prowess provided the power and money to fund his dreams of legitimacy, and his dreams of legitimacy, in turn, required ever more violence to protect and finance. This internal conflict was the engine of his life and the source of his tragedy. He was trapped between who he was and who he wanted to be, and the chasm between those two identities ultimately consumed him. The Flamingo was the physical manifestation of this struggle. A beautiful, glamorous palace built with blood money, a symbol of legitimacy financed by extortion and murder. He could not see that the methods of his old life were fundamentally incompatible with the goals of his new one. The Syndicate understood only the language of the old life. They did not care about his dreams, only his balance sheet. And when that balance sheet blood red, they responded with the only language they knew, the language he himself had taught them. This psychological portrait is further complicated by the undeniable thread of mental instability that ran through his life, hinted at by the hated nickname, Bugsy. His rages were not merely the calculated intimidation of a gangster. They were often described as primal, uncontrollable explosions that seemed to border on temporary insanity. This volatility, which had served him well as a young enforcer, became a profound liability as he ascended to a position requiring negotiation, patience, and long-term strategy. His management of the Flamingo project was not merely arrogant, it was obsessive and manic. He was incapable of compromise, of hearing bad news, of adapting his grand vision to the inconvenient realities of budgets and construction timelines. This single-mindedness, this Bugs quality, was the flip side of the visionary coin. The same mental wiring that allowed him to see a glorious city in an empty desert also prevented him from seeing the financial abyss he was marching toward. He was so possessed by the beauty of his dream that he became blind to the waking world, a world where partners demanded returns and where unchecked spending had fatal consequences. In this light, his story transcends the genre of a simple gangster tale and enters the realm of classical tragedy. He is not a villain, but a flawed hero, a man whose greatest strength, his boundless, audacious ambition, is also the fatal flaw that leads to his destruction. He is Icarus, flying too close to the sun on wings of his own construction. The wax that held those wings together was a mixture of stolen money, broken trust, and a self-belief so absolute it became a form of madness. The Las Vegas sun, the very one he sought to harness for his glittering oasis, melted that wax and sent him plummeting back to earth. His death was not just a gangland hit, it was the final, brutal act in a psychological drama that had been playing out for decades. The moment the street thug he had always been finally caught up with the visionary he had tried to become, and in the ensuing collision, both were utterly destroyed. All that remained was the dream, stripped of its creator, ready to be taken and perfected by colder, saner, and far less interesting men. The physical landscape of modern Las Vegas, in its overwhelming scale and sensory assault, is the ultimate realization of Bugsy Siegel's hallucination. A dream so fully realized, it has become a global commodity. To walk the Strip today is to walk through a monument to his failed ambition, a billion-dollar eulogy to his vision. The core principle he introduced, that a casino should be more than a gambling hall, that it must be a self-contained universe offering a total escape from reality, is now the unquestioned gospel of the entire hospitality and entertainment industry. Every themed resort, from the Venetian's canals to the Bellagio's fountains, is a direct descendant of his original insight. He understood that people do not just come to gamble, they come to be transported, to live for a few days inside a story. His story was one of Hollywood glamour and Monte Carlo sophistication, a narrative he sold with every imported piece of marble and every custom-designed suit. Today's corporations have simply expanded the palette of stories, offering ancient Egypt, medieval castles, or tropical islands, but the fundamental product is identical, a curated fantasy. The business model he pioneered, the integrated resort, is now a global standard, studied in business schools and replicated across the world. The concept of capturing a tourist's entire spending cycle, flight, room, food, entertainment, and gambling within a single corporate ecosystem is the direct legacy of his dream for the Flamingo. The corporate giants that now rule Las Vegas, entities like MGM Resorts and Caesars Entertainment, are the legitimate, publicly traded heirs to his criminal enterprise. They have systematized his inspiration, scaling it to a level he could never have imagined. But they are following the map he drew, the relentless pursuit of spectacle, the constant need to build bigger and more audacious attractions to lure visitors. This entire cycle of one-upmanship that defines modern Las Vegas began with his insistence that the Flamingo must be the most luxurious, the most opulent, the most breathtaking destination on Earth. He was the first to understand that in the desert, you must create your own oasis, and that the more spectacular the mirage, the more people will pay to believe it is real. Yet, for all this posthumous validation, the city has also evolved in ways that would likely sadden its original visionary. The corporatization of the Strip has sanitized it, draining away the very element of dangerous glamour that Siegel embodied. The mob's Las Vegas, for all its violence and corruption, had a raw, rebellious energy, a sense that anything could happen. It was a town run by outlaws, and that danger was part of its allure. The modern Las Vegas, with its focus on family, friendly attractions, convention business, and shareholder value, is a safer, cleaner, and more predictable place. The shadowy figures in the background are no longer gangsters, but hedge fund managers and corporate boards. The thrill is now carefully manufactured and risk-assessed, a far cry from the electric, unpredictable atmosphere of the city's early years. It is possible that Siegel would look upon this sanitized version of his dream with a sense of loss. The city he imagined was not a corporate theme park. It was a haven for high rollers and celebrities, a place where the rules were different and the nights were charged with possibility. The transition from a mob-owned playground to a corporate-owned destination represents the taming of his wild vision, the domestication of his dangerous dream. In this sense, his ghost might be a restless one, wandering through the gleaming, efficient casinos, recognizing the blueprint but mourning the loss of the reckless, chaotic spirit that gave it life. The multi-billion-dollar corporation that now owns the Flamingo does not trade on the memory of his violent temper or his criminal enterprises. It trades on the sanitized, romanticized version of his story, the visionary without the gangster. This is the final, complex layer of his legacy. His dream was so powerful that it had to be taken from him, purified of his toxic influence, and scaled into a global industry. The most fitting tribute to Bugsy Siegel is also the greatest betrayal of his spirit, the fact that his beautiful, dangerous dream became so successful that it had to be turned into something safe, manageable, and ultimately ordinary. The neon lights still blaze, but the man who first imagined their glow was extinguished long ago, a necessary sacrifice on the altar of the very future he dared to envision. The figure of Virginia Hill remains an inextricable and enigmatic part of the Bugsy Siegel tragedy, a character whose own mysterious life and motivations added layers of complexity to his final days and the lingering questions surrounding his murder. She was far more than just a glamorous accessory. She was a powerful, independent, and deeply involved player in the underworld ecosystem. A woman who understood the flow of money and power with an almost innate genius. Her relationship with Siegel was a partnership of kindred spirits, both obsessed with the high life, both possessing volatile tempers, and both operating with a sense of entitlement that often bordered on recklessness. While Siegel was pouring the Syndicate's money into the Flamingo's foundation, Hill was frequently traveling to Europe, often carrying large amounts of cash, which she would deposit in Swiss bank accounts. To Siegel's partners, this was not a coincidence. It was evidence of a massive embezzlement scheme, a belief that turned their frustration with the project's cost overruns into a white, hot fury of personal betrayal. Whether Hill was simply spending Siegel's money, acting as a courier for the Syndicate's own international money laundering, or whether the two were indeed systematically skimming from the Flamingo's budget, is a question that has never been conclusively answered. What is certain is that her actions, and Siegel's defense of them, painted a target on both their backs. Her sudden departure for Europe, just days before Siegel's murder, has been interpreted by many as the clearest sign that she knew the end was near, that she had been warned to leave while she still could. Her survival, juxtaposed with his brutal death, fueled endless speculation about her true role. Was she a victim, a femme fatale, or a cunning accomplice who managed to escape the consequences that befell her lover? Hill's life after Siegel's murder only deepened the mystery. She was hounded by the press and investigated by the Kefauver Committee, a Senate committee looking into organized crime, where she was notoriously uncooperative and defiant, famously telling the senators to kiss my ass. Her life spiraled into tragedy and further controversy. She eventually moved to Europe, where she married an Austrian artist and lived in relative obscurity until her death in 1966, which was ruled a suicide from a barbiturate overdose. The official story was that she walked into a snowstorm on a mountain near her home. But the circumstances were strange enough to fuel theories that she, too, had been silenced by the mob, that she knew too much and had finally become a liability. The relationship between Siegel and Hill is the great, unresolved human drama at the heart of the story. It was a partnership built on a foundation of passion, ambition, and shared secrets, and its catastrophic end ensured that those secrets would die with them. Her presence in the narrative adds a crucial dimension, moving it beyond a simple story of a gangster and his casino into a more Shakespearean tale of a powerful, doomed couple whose love was as destructive as it was passionate, and whose ultimate legacy was a trail of unanswered questions that lead directly to the heart of the darkness that built Las Vegas. She is the ghost beside his ghost, a reminder that behind every great, tragic figure, there is often an equally compelling and enigmatic partner, whose story is just as fraught with mystery and whose ultimate fate is just as sealed by the same unforgiving forces. The role of Meyer in the saga of Bugsy Siegel presents the most poignant. and morally complex layer of the entire tragedy. A relationship that forces us to examine the brutal choices demanded by a life of crime. Lansky and Siegel were not merely business associates. They were childhood friends who had risen from the gritty streets of New York together, who had built the Bugs and Meyer mob from nothing, and who trusted each other with their lives through the bloody bootlegging wars and the formation of the National Syndicate. Their bond was arguably the closest thing to genuine friendship either of them ever experienced. Lansky, the quiet, cerebral strategist, was the perfect counterweight to Siegel, the flashy, impulsive frontman. For decades, they operated as a single unit, their strengths complementing each other perfectly. This deep personal history is what makes the decision to eliminate Siegel so profoundly shocking and instructive. The prevailing theory, supported by most historians of organized crime, is that Meyer Lansky, however reluctantly, ultimately gave his consent to the hit on his oldest friend. This was not a decision born of petty jealousy or a sudden rift. It was a grim, calculated assessment made for the survival of the larger enterprise. Lansky was, above all else, a businessman, and Siegel's management of the Flamingo had become a catastrophic threat to their collective financial stability and credibility. The millions of dollars lost were not just Siegel's or Lansky's. They belonged to a board of the most dangerous men in America, men who would not accept excuses or romantic visions. For Lansky, it was a simple, devastating equation. Sacrifice his friend or risk the wrath and potential collapse of the entire syndicate. He chose the organization over the individual, the cold logic of the balance sheet over the warm bond of brotherhood. This decision forever defines the limits of loyalty in the underworld. It demonstrates that in the highest echelons of organized crime, there is no room for sentiment. That even the deepest personal bonds are ultimately subordinate to the demands of the business. The personal toll on Lansky, a man known for his impenetrable exterior, must have been immense, though he never spoke of it publicly. To have to sanction the murder of the man who had been like a brother to him, to know that he was sending his oldest friend to a violent death, would have left a permanent scar on his soul. Some speculate that the guilt, or at least the grim acceptance of this terrible necessity, is what fueled Lansky's own driven, almost joyless pursuit of wealth and power in the decades that followed. He became the archetype of the faceless behind the scene's power broker, a role that stood in stark contrast to Siegel's very public flame-out. In a way, Lansky learned the ultimate lesson from Siegel's failure, that in their world, visibility was vulnerability. He ensured that he would never become a celebrity, never fall in love with a project, never allow his ego to jeopardize the bottom line. He became the ghost in the machine, the unseen architect of a financial empire, all while living with the knowledge that his success was built, in part, on the corpse of his best friend. The story of their relationship is the tragic heart of the entire epic. It is a story of how two boys from nothing built an empire together, and how that very empire eventually demanded the blood of one as the price for the survival of the other. It is a narrative that echoes the oldest stories of betrayal and sacrifice, a reminder that the pursuit of power often exacts the most personal of costs. The silence Lansky maintained on the subject until his own death is perhaps the most powerful testimony of all. It was a silence that spoke volumes about the weight of the decision, a burden he carried alone, the final, unbreakable bond between the visionary who dreamed in neon and the calculator who managed the books in blood. The cultural appropriation of Bugsy Siegel's story began almost before his body was cold, transforming him from a man into a myth, a process that reveals as much about our society as it does about him. The press of the 1940s, hungry for a sensational story, immediately latched onto the dramatic elements. The handsome gangster, the Hollywood girlfriend, the desert palace, and the brutal, unsolved murder. They crafted a narrative that was part Greek tragedy, part film noir, a story so perfectly structured it felt scripted. This media framing laid the groundwork for his enduring legend, softening the harsh realities of his violent profession and emphasizing his role as a dreamer. This narrative was then amplified and romanticized for decades through popular culture, most notably in the 1991 film Bugsy, starring Warren Beatty. The film, while a work of fiction, was instrumental in cementing a specific and largely sympathetic image of Siegel in the public consciousness. It focused intensely on his vision for Las Vegas and his tumultuous relationship with Virginia Hill, portraying him as a flawed but ultimately visionary figure driven by a beautiful dream. The more sordid aspects of his life, his foundational role in Murder, Incorporated, his personal involvement in countless brutal killings, were pushed into the background, treated as incidental footnotes to the grander, more compelling story of his ambition. This sanitization is a common fate for historical outlaws. Think of Billy the Kid or Bonnie and Clyde, whose real-life violence has been largely overshadowed by their romanticized legends. We, as a culture, have a voracious appetite for the archetype of the noble outlaw, the rebel who challenges the system and pays the ultimate price. Bugsy Siegel fits this mold perfectly. He challenged the established order of both legitimate business and traditional organized crime, and he was destroyed for it. His story allows us to safely explore themes of ambition, rebellion, and the dark side of the American dream from a comfortable distance. We can admire his audacity without condoning his methods, and we can mourn his potential without having to confront the full, terrifying reality of his actions. This cultural repackaging has had a tangible impact, effectively making Bugsy Siegel a tourist attraction in the city he helped create. Visitors to Las Vegas can take tours that point out sites connected to his story, and the Flamingo Hotel itself, though vastly remodeled, still trades on its history as his creation. He has become a brand, a symbol of the city's wild and woolly past. This commercial exploitation of his legend is the final, ironic twist in his story. The man who sought so desperately to be seen as a legitimate businessman and a respected visionary achieved that status only in death, and only as a commodified piece of nostalgia. He is no longer a feared gangster, but a marketable character. his image sold on tea, shirts, and in history books, his name invoked to add a frisson of danger to a vacation package. This is a fate he likely could never have imagined, a transformation from public enemy to pop culture icon. The process ensures his immortality, but at the cost of his humanity. The real Benjamin Siegel, the complex, violent, charming, and deeply troubled man, has been replaced by a simplified two-dimensional caricature. Bugsy, the gangster with a dream. His legacy, therefore, exists on two parallel tracks: the historical reality of a pivotal figure in organized crime whose actions had devastating consequences for many, and the cultural myth of a tragic visionary whose death is a poignant footnote in the story of an American icon. We choose which version we want to see, and most of the time, we choose the myth. It is a more comfortable, more entertaining, and far less disturbing narrative, one that allows us to enjoy the glittering lights of Las Vegas without having to constantly remember that they were first powered by a generator fueled by blood and betrayal. The city moves forward, constantly reinventing itself, but the ghost of its founder remains, forever frozen in the glamorous, dangerous moment of his death, a permanent and profitable reminder of the price of a dream. The legal and law enforcement landscape that Bugsy Siegel both exploited and was ultimately ensnared by provides a critical backdrop to his rise and fall, illustrating the fragile boundary between impunity and accountability in mid-century America. For the majority of his criminal career, Siegel operated with a remarkable degree of immunity from the justice system. This was not an accident. It was a calculated strategy enabled by a combination of factors. The jurisdictional limitations of the era were a significant advantage. He committed crimes in New York, then moved to California, and finally embarked on his grand project in Nevada, staying one step ahead of local authorities who lacked the resources and legal framework to pursue complex, interstate criminal conspiracies. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, under J. Edgar Hoover, was notoriously slow to acknowledge the existence of a national crime syndicate, focusing instead on bank robbers and kidnappers, which allowed men like Siegel to build their empires in the shadows. Furthermore, Siegel mastered the art of corruption, leveraging his immense wealth to bribe public officials, police officers, and politicians, ensuring that eyes were conveniently averted and investigations were stymied before they could even begin. His legitimate front as a Hollywood businessman and sportsman provided a perfect cover, allowing him to mingle with the powerful and influential, thereby gaining a veneer of respectability that further insulated him from suspicion. He understood that the key to prolonged criminal success was not just evading the law, but manipulating the system itself, creating a protective shell of bought influence and manufactured legitimacy. This environment of perceived invincibility undoubtedly fueled his audacity, convincing him that the rules that applied to others did not apply to him. It was this same sense of invincibility that allowed the Flamingo project to spiral so far out of control. He truly believed that as long as he kept his powerful friends happy, there would be no reckoning for the financial chaos. However, this reckoning did not come from a court of law. It came from his own partners, who operated under a far more swift and unforgiving legal code. The Syndicate's justice system was not burdened by warrants, evidentiary rules, or jury trials. Its verdicts were final, and its sentences were carried out with brutal efficiency. Siegel's downfall demonstrates the ultimate limitation of corrupting the legitimate world. It offers no protection from the parallel justice system of the underworld. When his financial mismanagement crossed from being a problem into being a threat, the very corruption that had shielded him became irrelevant. The police he had bribed in Los Angeles could not protect him from assassins sent by New York. The politicians in Nevada could not intervene in a Syndicate boardroom decision. The system he had so skillfully manipulated for decades was powerless against the cold, internal logic of the organization he had helped to build. In the end, the only law that mattered was the law of the jungle, the same law he had lived by since his days on the streets of Williamsburg. His murder was a stark demonstration that for all his sophistication, his wealth, and his connections, he was still ultimately subject to the primal rules of his profession. The state had failed to hold him accountable for his many crimes, but his own industry did not. This irony is central to his story. The man who escaped the reach of the American legal system for his entire life was ultimately judged and executed by a tribunal of his peers. A grim parody of justice that highlights the complete failure of the authorities of the time to confront the rising power of organized crime. It would take years and the work of committees like the Kefauver Committee for the federal government to begin to understand and combat the national syndicate that Siegel and Lansky had helped create. But for Bugsy Siegel, that understanding came far too late. His story stands as a permanent testament to a specific moment in American history when the criminals were so powerful, so sophisticated, and so embedded in the fabric of society that the only court that could truly touch them was their own. The geographical journey of Bugsy Siegel from the crowded, vertical canyons of New York City to the vast, horizontal emptiness of the Nevada desert is not just a change of scenery, but a profound metaphor for his psychological and professional evolution. New York was his crucible, a place of intense competition, close quarters violence, and entrenched hierarchies. It was a world of shadows and brick, where power was won block by block, and allegiances were constantly tested. In this environment, Siegel thrived as a predator, his violent instincts perfectly suited to the urban jungle. His rise within the Bugs and Meyer mob, and later the Syndicate, was a testament to his effectiveness within this defined, brutal ecosystem. Yet, the very congestion of New York, both physical and criminal, ultimately chafed against his growing ambition. He was one of many powerful figures, forced to negotiate, share territory, and answer to a collective authority. His move to California was the first step into a wider world. Los Angeles offered space, both literal and metaphorical. It was a city of perception and illusion, where image was everything, and Siegel, the handsome, charismatic gangster, could reinvent himself as a businessman and socialite. The sunshine and sprawling boulevards provided a stage for his new persona, but it was still a city with its own established power structures and rival gangs. It was only when he looked upon the empty desert of Las Vegas that he found a canvas vast enough for his grandest ambitions. The desert represented absolute potential. There were no old world bosses to answer to, no entrenched rivals to fight, just miles of empty sand waiting for a definition. This emptiness mirrored the blank slate he desired for his own legacy. He was no longer content to be a lieutenant in someone else's empire. He wanted to be the architect of his own. The desert offered him that opportunity, a place where he could build not just a casino, but a kingdom, a personal fiefdom far from the meddling eyes of his New York partners. This geographical shift, however, also contained the seeds of his isolation and ultimate downfall. The very emptiness that offered him freedom also severed him from the grounding influences and harsh realities of his old life. In New York, surrounded by his peers, his more outlandish ideas might have been tempered by the practical skepticism of a Meyer. In the isolation of the Nevada desert, surrounded by yes men, construction workers, and the sycophantic admiration of Hollywood friends, his vision became an unmoored obsession. The distance from the Syndicate's center of power in New York allowed him to believe he was beyond their reach, that he was the master of his own domain. He failed to understand that the money pipeline that stretched from the East Coast to the desert was a tether, not a grant of independence. When he began to sever that tether through mismanagement and suspected theft, the Syndicate simply reeled him back in the most permanent way possible. The desert, which had promised him freedom, became his trap. The vast, open spaces that allowed his dream to flourish also provided no cover when the assassins came. The isolation he had cultivated made him an easy, stationary target. His journey, therefore, is a tragic arc from the collective, claustrophobic violence of the city to the solitary, exposed ambition of the desert. He sought space to become a king, but in that space, he lost the connection to the realities of his world and became a phantom, a mirage that could be erased as easily as it had been conceived. The city of Las Vegas that now fills that desert stands as the ultimate rebuttal to his desire for a personal kingdom. It is a monument not to one man, but to the corporate, impersonal power of the very system he tried to escape. He fled the crowded East to build his own world, only to discover that the world he left behind was the only one that truly held any power, and its long arm could reach even into the heart of the empty desert, delivering a final, violent message that no one, not even a self-proclaimed king, is ever truly alone. The financial details of the Flamingo project, when examined not as abstract numbers, but as a real time hemorrhage of capital, reveal the precise moment when Bugsy Siegel crossed the line from valuable asset to intolerable liability. The initial investment from the Syndicate, believed to be around $1 million, was already a staggering sum in the 1940s, a vote of confidence in Siegel's vision and his ability to deliver. This was not a gift. It was a high-interest loan from the most dangerous bankers in the world, with an expectation of swift and substantial returns. The first signs of trouble emerged with the procurement of materials. Siegel's insistence on only the finest, Italian marble custom-made furniture, gold-plated fixtures, collided head-on with the reality of post-war shortages and inflated costs. But the problem was deeper than market forces. It was systemic corruption from within. The construction syndicate, controlled by his own criminal associates, saw the project as a bottomless well from which to draw. They submitted grossly inflated invoices for materials and labor, and Siegel, in his frantic rush to see his dream realized, signed off on them without question. Truckloads of supplies would arrive, and the bills would be mysteriously padded. Construction crews, knowing the boss was desperate to meet his self-imposed deadlines, would work at a snail's pace to maximize overtime. This was a classic mob skim operation, but it was one being perpetrated against the mob itself, with Siegel as the willing, or willfully blind, conduit. The budget spiraled from 1 million to 2, then 3, and eventually to an almost incomprehensible $6 million. To put this in perspective, the entire Manhattan Project to build the atomic bomb cost around $2 billion. Siegel was spending the equivalent of a significant fraction of a world-changing scientific endeavor on a single hotel and casino in the desert. Each time he went back to his partners, hat in hand, asking for more, he was not just requesting funds. He was eroding their trust and in their eyes, making a mockery of their business acumen. The suspicion of outright embezzlement, whether fully true or not, was the final, unforgivable sin. Virginia Hill's notorious trips to Europe, where she would deposit large sums of cash into Swiss bank accounts, were seen by the syndicate not as the whims of an extravagant girlfriend, but as evidence that Siegel was not just a poor manager, but a thief stealing from his own partners. The sheer scale of the financial failure became a personal insult to men like Lansky and Luciano, who prided themselves on their financial cunning. It made them look like fools, and in their world, that was a more dangerous transgression than murder. The disastrous soft opening in December 1946 was the final proof of concept, but it was a proof of failure. The high rollers detected the crooked games and felt cheated. The unfinished hotel was an embarrassment. The bad weather was seen as a cosmic omen. The casino lost over $100,000 in its first 2 weeks, a death knell. At this point, the financial analysis was complete from the syndicate's perspective. The project was a black hole. Siegel had proven himself incapable of managing a budget, susceptible to skimming from his own people, and arrogant in the face of their concerns. The cold calculus of their world demanded a solution. The cost of eliminating him, a few $1,000s for a team of shooters, was negligible compared to the millions already lost and the potential future millions the Flamingo could generate under competent management. His murder was, in the most literal sense, a sound business decision, a strategic right off of a failed executive to protect the health of the larger corporation. The fact that the Flamingo became immensely profitable just months after his death under Gus Greenbaum only retroactively justified their decision, proving that the asset was valuable, but the manager was defective. The financial trail of the Flamingo is therefore the true murder weapon, a paper trail of inflated invoices, embezzled funds, and catastrophic losses that led, as directly as a line of gunpowder, to the trigger being pulled on that warm June evening. Siegel wasn't killed for his dream. He was killed for his terrible, and in their eyes, treacherous, accounting. And so we arrive at the end of our journey, a journey that began in the squalor of tenements and ended in the blazing neon of a created paradise, a path paved with equal parts vision and violence. The story of Bugsy Siegel is the foundational epic of modern Las Vegas, a cautionary tale written in blood and money that continues to captivate and horrify in equal measure. He was a man of profound contradictions, a killer who dreamed of beauty, a gangster who craved legitimacy, a visionary whose own flaws made him incapable of bringing his vision to life. He looked into the emptiness of the desert and saw a glittering future, a city of sin and spectacle that would become an enduring symbol of the American appetite for risk and reward. His great, tragic insight was that people would travel to the ends of the earth for an experience, for a story, for a chance to live inside a fantasy, even for just a weekend. This idea, more than any single building, is his true legacy, a philosophy that now drives the global entertainment and hospitality industry. Yet, for all his foresight, he was blind to the practical realities of finance and the unforgiving nature of the underworld. He called home. His ambition, the very engine of his rise, became the poison that ensured his fall. He believed his dream placed him above the rules, both of business and of the Syndicate, and he paid for that belief with his life on a quiet evening in Beverly Hills, a death as sudden and brutal as the life he had lived. His legacy is a complex and permanent stain on the American tapestry. He is remembered not for the lives he ruined or the murders he committed, but for the city he imagined. Las Vegas stands as his tombstone and his monument, a $1 billion validation of a dream that cost a man his soul. Every time a new resort opens its doors, every time a tourist gazes in wonder at the dazzling lights of the Strip, they are participating in the world Bugsy Siegel willed into existence. He is the ghost in the machine, the original sin, the prophet who was not honored in his own land. His story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about ambition, morality, and the price of success. It reminds us that the line between visionary and fanatic is often vanishingly thin, and that the pursuit of a dream can be the most dangerous gamble of all. The lights of Las Vegas will never go out. They will only grow brighter and more numerous, a perpetual, shimmering tribute to the man who first saw their potential. But if you listen closely, in the quiet moments between the ringing of slot machines and the bustle of the crowds, you might just hear the echo of a single, final gunshot, a reminder that every dream has its cost, and every paradise has its price. The story of Bugsy Siegel is now complete, a narrative woven from history and myth, a tale of a man, a dream, and the city that consumed them both. We have journeyed together through this epic, and now, As we reach its conclusion, we invite you to become a part of our community. If this deep dive into history's shadows captivated you, if you were fascinated by the rise and fall of this complex figure, then please show your support. Like this video, subscribe to the channel for more meticulously researched deep dives into the stories that shaped our world, and ring the notification bell so you never miss a journey into the past. We rely on you, our viewers, to help us continue unearthing and sharing these incredible narratives. Your engagement fuels our research and allows us to bring these hidden histories to light. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to seeing you on the next exploration.